They said I would not live through Thanksgiving. I just smiled and poured myself another glass of wine. Because sometimes when the betrayer thinks you are old, that is when they forget that experience is the most dangerous weapon. I did not shout. I did not smash things. I did not take blood revenge. I only used what they underestimated most: silence, the law, and evidence. That night, when the poisoned glass intended for me was swapped, justice took a different course, and their whole world collapsed under the flashing lights of the police. If you have ever been betrayed by your own family, ever been regarded as useless, too old, or easy to fool, stay with me to the end of this journey, because the story you're about to hear is not just about revenge, but about truth lit by mercy. Please hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the name of the city where you are listening so I know where the light of Hollow Pines has reached. Because wherever there are people who still believe in justice, there, the light will never go out. An early November evening at Hollow Pines always carries a particular kind of silence. Not the kind of silence when a city goes to sleep, but the stillness that makes you hear a clock hand fall onto the wooden floor. The pine forest surrounding my house felt like an overly old embrace, the dark canopy whispering in the cold wind. I had just cleared the dining table and was about to brew a pot of herbal tea out of habit. The yellow light spilled through the window, illuminating the geological maps hung all over the wall, the memory of my 30 years. Thomas's tablet was still on the kitchen table from when he stopped by in the afternoon. I intended to take it up to my study to charge it when the screen lit up. The words, "Grace Avery, FaceTime call," appearing along with a soft ringtone. I touched it lightly, thinking the call was for me, but half a second later I realized I was not the one being called. The device had automatically answered due to a touch. Thomas has left the tablet here since the afternoon. His tablet and his phone share an Apple account, so when Grace called FaceTime, both devices rang. I knew that. I had helped him set it up for convenience. So when the screen lit and auto answered, I understood. This call was not for me, but I shouldn't hang up immediately either. The voice from the other end sounded clear and cold like the wind on the porch. "Remember this," Grace, Thomas's wife, whispered. Her breath hurried like someone trying to keep a secret. "After the Thanksgiving dinner, he will drink your wine. Then just call 911, say he had a heart attack. No one will suspect a 68-year-old. For the first few seconds, I thought I had heard wrong. My heart hammered like a hammer against the wooden wall, but I did not move. I did not ask, did not speak, just stood with my back against the refrigerator, eyes fixed on the bright screen. Thomas answered, his voice hoarse. "If this does not work, we lose everything, Grace. Bank debt, the house foreclosed, that damned company gone. He does not need money, living in the woods with his old maps. We need this house." A vague sigh, then Grace continued, low and sharp as a paper cut. "You're right, he would never sign. But if he goes, the house is ours. I have checked the papers. The beneficiary has not been updated." I leaned my hand on the table to keep from falling. The scent of pine in the house suddenly grew strong, choking me in my throat. In my head, the image of my late wife, Margaret, appeared, smiling gently in the pine sunshine of years past. She has been gone 10 years, and it was on this land that I rebuilt my life, one plank at a time. I took a long breath, forcing my heart back to normal. In geology, I once stood through earthquakes and still had to keep my ruler straight. Now I only needed to keep my hand from trembling. I turned off the kitchen light, and the room sank into the pale blue glow of the screen. From the dark, I could clearly see Thomas's face in the small corner of the FaceTime screen. My son, the one I taught to hold a chisel and read a compass. I took my phone from my coat pocket and opened the voice memo app. In Idaho, the law allows recording when one party knows, and tonight I suddenly felt I needed to remember every sound of this conversation, not for revenge, but to have evidence of the truth. The press of the record button sounded small, like an insect. "So how will you prepare?" Grace asked. "Just let me handle it. He still thinks you adore him. Just attend Thanksgiving, smile a little, raise your glass. Everything will be over. He dies at dinner, and everyone will think it was his heart." Grace let out a soft laugh. "Sounds easier than a week of detox." That laugh chilled me more than the wind on the porch. I heard Thomas say something else, his voice fading, then the call ended. The screen went black, leaving only my reflected face, the man with silver hair, whose eyes had just lost something I had believed permanent for 68 years. Faith in blood ties. I stood motionless for a long time. The wall clock struck 10, each tick sounding like a countdown. I stepped out to the porch, opened the door, letting the forest breeze in. The cold stung my eyes, but my mind cleared strangely. In the dark, the straight trunks of the pines reflected the pale moon, the very trees I had once measured foot by foot to preserve the land, now witnessing my son measure the line between his father's life and death. I returned to the kitchen, saved the recording, and named the file, November 3rd, Hollow Pines. My hand did not shake. I put the tablet in the drawer, locked it, then sat down. The wood creaked under my weight, but my mind had already drawn the first straight lines of a plan. Not to take revenge, but to protect the truth. In my profession, people always say, if you measure wrong by an inch, the whole mountain will collapse. My son mismeasured a father's trust, and I, who once taught him how to mark property boundaries, will now teach him one last lesson: how to measure the boundary of morality. I turned off the light, standing in the dark, listening only to the wind circling the roof. Then very quietly I whispered, my voice as light as breath, drifting in the mist, "My son, you have just taught me how to remeasure trust." The following weekend, Hollow Pines glowed in the late afternoon, the pine forest a pale gold carpet of autumn stretching down to the base of the hill. I set the dining table on the porch, the old checked cloth Margaret used to love, 3 white porcelain plates, and 3 glasses of red wine. Everything looked like a normal family evening. I still remember Grace's words from the call last week, each word engraved in my head. But today I was not the betrayed father. I was an observer, a geologist testing the fissures of earth and rock, only this time the sample was my own family. The sound of a car engine came from afar, echoing through the old trunks. I looked down the dirt road winding around the hillside, Thomas's SUV coming up, its headlights lighting the whole incline. When the car stopped, Thomas stepped out first, hands in his coat pockets, and Grace followed, carrying a basket of pastries. Her perfume trailed lightly in the air, a sweet scent so artificial it tasted false. "Father, we're here," Thomas said, forcing cheer, but there was something sharp in his tone. "Good, I just opened a bottle," I said, still calm, holding a bottle of Bordeaux from 2014, the one I had saved for important occasions. Who would have thought today would be such an occasion? We sat at the table. Grace smiled gently, poured water, and arranged the bread, as if she had never spoken the line, "He will drink your wine." I watched her. Her smile was perfect, to the point of being terrifying. Thomas sat opposite, eyes flickering with impatience, but he tried to appear at ease. The meal began with idle questions: health, work, weather, the hollow dialogue people use to hide what truly matters. When the salmon was served, Thomas cleared his throat and straightened. "Father," he said, his voice slow as someone stepping on thin ice, "I'm trying to pull the company back, but things are really hard. Partners pulled out, the bank is tightening. We're thinking maybe selling the city house, moving to Boise, living more frugally." I nodded, silent. Grace glanced at her husband, then continued in a voice soft as silk, "But if you could help, maybe we wouldn't have to. The company just needs a little capital to cover loans and keep the project afloat. If you signed over this house, we could use it as collateral to save things." I set my knife down. Candlelight played across their faces. too young. People dressed nicely, yet their eyes could not meet mine. Signed over? I asked slowly. Grace smiled. Just temporary, Father. When the project recovers, we will return it. This house will still be yours. How much? I asked, my voice low and steady like the sound of earth when one drills deep to find an aquifer. Thomas exhaled, avoiding my gaze. 280,000, he said, almost a whisper. That should be enough for me to manage. When the company recovers, I'll buy back the papers. You'll still have a place to live. You won't lose anything. The air on the porch seemed to freeze. Wind through the window sashes made a rustling like a distant warning. My old cat, Winston, crawled from under the table, rubbed against my leg, then looked up with pale yellow eyes, bright and asking, Father, what will you do now? I smiled, lifted the bottle, and poured 3 full glasses. The deep red liquid reflected the candle like blood soaking into wood. I handed them their glasses, my voice gentle. All right, I will think about it. Thomas sighed as if a burden was lifted. Grace took her husband's hand, her smile blooming. I raised my glass, swirled the wine in the dim light, then looked them straight in the eye. I have spent my life measuring depth. I paused, my finger tapping the rim of the glass. Not shallowness. Grace's smile faltered. Thomas's face flickered with alarm, but I stood and carried the bottle inside. Outside, the pines whispered on like someone murmuring in the dark. Inside me, a plan was forming, step by step, every detail precise, as when I drew my first geological map. That night, I sat alone in my study, opened my notebook, and wrote a single line. Measure the depth of the human heart, hollow pines, the 10th of November. Beneath it, I drew a thin red line, the line that would begin justice. The next morning, fog lay thick over the hollow pines forest. Weak sunlight barely pierced the cloud layer to glint on the glass of my old pickup. I drove down from the hill toward downtown Orofino. The familiar road winding along the Clearwater now looked through the gray mist like a distant memory. A place where I used to take students for field surveys when I was still teaching. Among those faces was one who is now my only hope. Mara Kincaid. Her law office sat in a 2-story brick building with a small cafe beneath and a sign that read, Kincaid and Associates, Elder Law and Estate Protection. I pushed the door and the bell chimed softly. Mara looked up, her brown eyes widening in surprise. Good heavens, Professor Leonard. I thought you were retired. I smiled. Retired people still need somewhere to retire to, Mara. But it seems someone else wants to help choose that place for me sooner than planned. She invited me to sit and poured me a cup of herbal tea. Her office was tidy, papers neatly stacked in aluminum trays, and her graduation photo hung straight on the wall. Mara had been an excellent student back then, practical, frank, and quicker than anyone at grasping property law. Now she still had that look, only much sharper. Tell me, who is bothering you? She asked, voice slow. I told her everything. The FaceTime call, the staged dinner, the proposal to sign over the house to save the company. She listened in silence, occasionally jotting a note. When I finished, she opened her computer, searched the Clearwater County records, typed a few commands, then spun the screen for me to see. This is the first thing, she said, pointing at the document on the screen. Thomas and Grace have no legal ownership rights to your house. They were only permitted temporary residence under the hospital care stay agreement you signed when your wife passed, essentially a lodger agreement to provide care during the funeral. That contract expired 8 years ago. There is no addendum, no extension. That means they are merely staying as guests. I nodded, feeling a cool draft fill my chest. Everything suddenly became clear and precise, like a geological map after a dust storm. Good, so I am not mad, I said, voice low. Mara gave a half smile. You are not mad. You have been betrayed, and betrayal must be handled with paperwork, not with anger. She stood, took a sample file from the cabinet, and flipped through the pages. Here is what I advise you to do immediately. Create a new living trust. The Hollow Pines property will be transferred to the Portland Education Foundation, the education fund you used to donate to. You will retain a life estate, meaning you keep the right to live in, use, and control the property for life. After your death, the foundation will be the legal heir. She paused, looking at me over her glasses. That way, they cannot mortgage, sell, or use the property as collateral for a single dollar. And if they try to sign forged documents, we can countersue for notarization fraud. I looked down at the white papers, the small print, the blank signature lines, all like legal weapons, colder and more precise than any threat. About the FaceTime, she added. If you have the recording, send me a copy. Idaho is a one-party consent state, valid to submit as precautionary evidence. I took my phone out, opened the file, November 3rd, Hollow Pines, and set it on the table. She copied it to a USB and affixed an evidence seal. Now you're safe, she said, her voice softening. But you must be careful. If they suspect, they may act sooner. I nodded, my gaze stopping at the window. People hurrying by, none aware that a quiet battle had just been plotted within these four walls. Mara tidied the file, then suddenly paused and asked, I just want to know, why are you doing all of this? For revenge? I looked up. Sunlight flashed on her face, reflecting the eyes of the student I once taught. No, I said slowly. I only want the final lesson to be memorable. The room fell silent. The printer stopped. Only the ticking clock remained. Mara nodded, then signed the last page and stamped it red. As I left the office, the rain began to fall lightly. Raindrops streaked down the car glass in long lines, like rules drawing out the map of justice about to be drawn. And in that moment, I understood. Sometimes a teacher's final lesson is not taught in a classroom, but in the way he teaches the betrayer the true limits of mercy. The desk lamp cast a warm light over the old wooden table, the glow tracing thin lines across the geological map I hung across the wall. The strata, the fault lines, the groundwater veins I have spent a lifetime tracing. That night, Hollow Pines was quiet in its own way, the wind whispering, the chimney sometimes creaking softly. I sat amid a pile of papers, pen in hand, my thinking slow as when reading a cross-section. Each layer, each piece of evidence must be recorded, preserved, and explained in its proper place. The first thing I did was call the bank, not to beg, but to gather evidence. Because Thomas once borrowed an auxiliary card from me to pay for gas. Last summer, I remember it clearly. I knew I could pull transaction statements from that secondary account. Calling through the secure line, I requested the statement for the most recent 3 months, printed the originals, and archived copies. When the pages flipped under the lamp, a number tightened my chest. A recent deposit to Thomas's account, $28,700. Transferred from an unknown source, noted as quick debt repayment. Financial traces are hard to deny. They are as cold as stone. I did not simply read the number and move on. I photographed each page of the statement, stamped them with timestamps, and then saved digital copies to 2 separate hard drives. One copy I placed on a sealed USB so that if it needed to be submitted as evidence, the chain would remain intact. In my trade, when we mark a core sample, we must record exactly the position and the depth. In life, evidence needs similar markers: source, time, and sender. Next, I hunted for clues online. There are things people assume private that accidentally surface on public pages. A post, a story, a boastful photo. I combed Grace's social accounts. There was an old video posted shortly after a large transfer. Grace standing next to a new Jeep, smiling brightly, saying roughly, "A surprise gift from my love." The upload time matched the week. The statement showed the $28,700 transfer. Photo and video metadata contained timestamps and upload IDs. I saved everything, downloaded original files, and preserved the source links. When the statement, the video, and the timestamps are presented side by side, the picture ceases to be mere words and becomes a chain of evidence. I am no technophile, but I know how to turn tools into allies. I learned how to check an image's EXIF data, how to export logs from sales pages if needed, and how to request transactional data from carriers. I printed all documents, sealed them, and signed the corner like a surveyor, stamping a sample. Collecting evidence is not a spur-of-the-moment act. It is a scientific survey. Form a hypothesis, gather data, verify sources, and confirm. Then I decided to strengthen physical surveillance of my house, not to eavesdrop, but to preserve the truth. I bought a commercial mini camera with a wide-angle, high-resolution, night recording capability, and both local memory and cloud backup. I chose a compact model, easy to conceal but legally straightforward. Filming on my own property is legal here in Idaho, so long as I do not invade privacy in bathrooms or bedrooms when they are guests. I mounted it in the corner of the kitchen where cups and behavior around meal preparation are visible. The frame was fixed, not mobile. The goal was to record actions at the table if anything suspicious occurred. Before tucking the camera into a wooden nook, I tested it 3 times. Real-time audio recording, night video quality, and upload latency to the cloud. Each test I logged technically: date, time, room temperature, battery status, and installation position. I stamped the device box with the date and photographed the installation scene with the fixed viewpoint so that later the sequence could not be denied, that I installed the camera before the event. I also thought through the evidence storage chain. Digital evidence can be accused of tampering if there is no log. So I followed the procedure: back up the original files, record check, sums for each file, print paper copies, sign them for authentication, and send a secure copy to Mara, a third party, to hold the evidence. I called her and arranged an afternoon meeting. Method is work, not emotion. All of these steps took time. It was not something finished in one evening. From the moment I heard the call to when I met Mara and installed the camera, time passed in 2 weeks. Long enough for their plan to continue. Long enough for me to prepare each step. 2 weeks is a reasonable span. Not rushed, but not so slow that they could escalate their foolishness. In those 2 weeks, I worked like an engineer, measuring, comparing, narrowing. I printed a financial map, the transfers, the social posts, the video upload dates, and the camera installation log. Each fragment was placed in its proper slot. Winston, the old cat, still slept on the sofa, occasionally waking to look at me as if testing the engine of his master's mind. The night before, I stabilized everything. I opened my notebook and wrote in black ink. A simple line, cold but meaningful, which I then signed below like sealing a file. On the 14th day, the digging plan is complete. They only need to fall on their own. I closed the notebook, snuffed the light, and listened to the wind as if nature itself were offering reassurance, waiting for a natural event, not a hasty strike. That morning, the sky over Orofino was heavy with fog, sunlight slipping through the window slats to paint long streaks across the wooden floor. I rose early, brewed coffee, and organized my notes. Today the appraiser was coming, Chris Wan, an independent evaluator I had met years ago on a forest conservation project. I wanted a precise number for Hollow Pines, not only to know the true worth of where I lived, but also to set a trap that was both legal and subtle. A small truck pulled up outside. A man in his 40s wearing a brown jacket and carrying a laser gauge stepped out with a thick folder. "Mr. Leonard, been a while. I hear you want a full appraisal on the property?" I nodded calmly. "That's right. Be as thorough as before, Chris. I want the current value if sold, including the northern forest section." He smiled, opened his device, and began measuring, noting every room. For 2 hours he worked methodically, taking photos, checking the foundation, assessing the roof, and recording regional averages. I watched, saying little. When he finished, we sat at the kitchen table where the midday light filtered through the blinds in soft gold bands. "Mr. Leonard," Chris said carefully, "based on maintenance, location, and the forest and pond behind the property, your home appraises at roughly $520,000. After fees, taxes, and commission, you'd net around $407,000. I nodded slightly, writing the figures in my notebook. "Thank you, Chris. Clear and reliable." He packed up, shook my hand, and headed to his truck. I walked him to the porch, sunlight flickering through the pines. As he opened his door, I heard a faint sound behind me. Across the hall, Thomas had just stepped out of Margaret's old study, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low but urgent. "Yeah, that price works," he murmured. "520 gross, 407 net. As long as he dies on time, the papers stay clean." I froze. In that instant, the wind under the eaves seemed to stop. Every sound in the forest vanished into the void. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had dug the foundation of this house and planted each pine, and felt a coldness spread through my chest. But reason took over. This was no longer pain, but evidence. I stepped quietly into the kitchen and carefully pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb pressed the voice memo icon, started recording, and pointed the mic toward the hallway. Thomas's voice continued, each word distinct. "Yeah, I already said. Once he's gone, the house transfers. I'll handle the paperwork, and Grace takes care of the wine. After Thanksgiving, it's done." Each word landed like nails into wood. I stayed silent, motionless, letting the device capture everything. When the call ended, I stopped the recording and placed the phone on the table. The screen showed a new file. Voice 1117, Hollow Pines. I opened my notebook and wrote the final line of the day in firm script. "Good. Now I have the sale price and the proof of a purchased death." I closed the book and looked out the window, where the pines swayed in the fading light. The wind carried the scent of resin and the faint clink of metal from outside, the familiar sound of hollow pines, now like the toll of a bell, foretelling a quake not of the earth, but of the human heart. 2 days later, I returned to Mara Kincaid's office. The morning in Orofino was wrapped in silver fog, and yellow leaves drifted down from the trees outside the window. On her desk sat neatly stacked folders, each stamped with a fresh red notary seal. She looked up when I entered, her eyes steady but cautious, the look of someone who knew this morning would mark the boundary between calm and confrontation. "You're right on time," Mara said, smiling slightly. "The documents are ready. We'll transfer ownership of the Hollow Pines property to the Portland Education Foundation, per your request." She slid the file toward me. On the first page, in bold print, "Deed of transfer. Grantor retains full life estate." I read each line carefully. The house, the northern woods, the lakeside tract, all listed in full, with clauses confirming my lifetime right to live in, use, and control the property. No one could force a sale, mortgage, or transfer. "This part is the most important," Mara explained, pointing to the final clause. "If Thomas or Grace attempts to interfere, it will fall under undue influence, coercion of an elder for financial gain. In Idaho, that carries heavy penalties, especially when prior evidence is on record." I nodded and signed the corner of each page, the pen gliding smoothly like I was redrawing a personal map of justice. When I finished, Mara sealed the documents, affixed stamps, and called the recorder's office, the Clearwater County Property Registry. "We're filing the original today," she said evenly into the phone. "Please confirm processing time." A voice on the other end replied, 2 to 3 business days, Ms. Kincaid. Once complete, the certified copy will be part of the public record." Mara hung up and looked at me. "That concludes the legal side. Now for your safety." I knew what she meant. From my coat pocket, I took out a sealed envelope. Inside were the voice recording of Thomas saying, "As long as he dies on time," and the mini camera footage of Grace testing the poisoned wine in the kitchen the night before. I placed both beside the notarized file. Mara put on thin gloves, opened the devices, verified the originals, and confirmed the timestamps matched the camera logs. Then she dialed directly to Sheriff Miles Harlan of Clearwater County, with whom she had worked on several elder abuse cases before. "Hello, Miles. This is Kincaid," she said. "I have a suspected case, potential conspiracy to poison an elder, with both audio and video evidence. The victim is Mr. Leonard Pike, fully competent and present. I'm requesting an immediate file under Elder Abuse Prevention Code 12-117C. The voice on the other end was firm. "Secure the evidence. I'll send 2 deputies immediately. File 12-117C will be opened today." Mara set the phone down and met my gaze. "You should prepare yourself. From this point, every move they make will be under legal surveillance. But that also means you must remain calmer than ever." I smiled. "Calm is my profession, Mara. When a man has measured the depth of the earth, he learns how to wait." 2 officers arrived that afternoon with evidence-sealing forms. They duplicated the recordings, inspected the device, drafted the initial report, and signed their confirmations. Sheriff Harlan called me personally. "Mr. Pike, I want you to know your case is now under official investigation. If there's any unusual activity from Thomas or Grace, contact me directly. No dispatch needed." I thanked him, my voice strangely steady. When they left, Mara walked me to the door. She placed a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "Now you've built your wall. All you have to do is wait for them to climb it and fall." I stepped out onto the porch. The sky over Orofino was still gray. In the distance, the hollow pines forest shimmered with the bronze hue of late autumn. Through the glass door, I saw my reflection faintly between light and shadow, the line between father and betrayed man. The wind rose, pine needles drifting, the forest rustling in a way both familiar and foreboding, not violent, not loud, just the subtle motion that foretells something coming. I stood still, feeling in that chill air a warning that needed no words. Then I spoke softly, as if to the trees themselves. The forest doesn't need to shout to warn. It simply changes color before the storm. That night carried an unusual warmth for November, a warmth that meant snow was coming soon. Hollow pines remained quiet, as if breathing softly, and the house was full of the scent of pumpkin pie and baked cinnamon, the smells of old Thanksgivings when Margaret was still alive. I sat at my desk, the lamp casting light across the folded geological map, my finger tapping the rhythm. Everything was ready. The papers had been transferred to the Portland Education Foundation. The police file was opened, and the kitchen camera was still recording continuously. Now there was only one last thing, to see what they would do when they thought I no longer suspected anything. At about 8 o'clock in the evening, there was a knock at the door. Thomas came in wearing a thick sweater, carrying a manila envelope. Grace followed, smiling gently, her voice honeyed. "Father, we brought the papers so we won't have to worry about finances tomorrow. It's just a small formality." I looked up and gave the gentle smile I had practiced for weeks. "What papers need to be signed tonight?" Thomas pulled a chair, produced a pre-printed packet with the bold heading in the corner, "General Durable Power of Attorney." He spoke slowly, trying to keep his voice normal. "You know, tomorrow we'll be busy. I'm worried things will get mixed up with the bank. This is just a temporary power of attorney, so I can manage accounts, pay bills, and sign if you're tired. I just want you to feel secure." Grace laid her hand on his shoulder and added in a voice so sweet it made the air thick, "We're only thinking of you. It's just sensible to be prepared." I watched them, my hand feigning a tremor as if I were weakening. Old age, my eyes are dim. Give me time to read it carefully. I opened the packet and pretended to read every line while secretly photographing each page with a phone hidden beneath the table. The printed text contained ambiguous clauses. Principal grants full authority over all accounts, real estate and healthcare decisions, full unlimited powers. I read outwardly indifferent while my eyes recorded every detail. Thomas grew impatient. You trust me, just sign it and it'll be done. I smiled, my voice like a breeze. Of course, I trust you. But I still prefer to read carefully. My mind's been slow these days. I'll sign tomorrow. Grace nodded, forcing a smile. Whatever you prefer, Father. We'll remind you in the morning. They wished me a good night and went upstairs. I sat a while longer, hearing their footsteps fade and the study door close. The house settled into silence, punctuated only by the faint tick of the oven and the wind tapping the windows. I took my phone, photographed each page of the POA under the desk lamp, and sent them immediately to Mara. The message was only a few words. Verify urgently. Look suspicious. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Mara's reply appeared. Forgery. Font taken from an online template. Notary seal not genuine. If they file it, it adds document forgery. I read slowly, then set the phone down. Now everything was clear. They were not merely trying to seize assets. They were prepared to forge documents to legalize it. My calm at that moment was no longer restrained, but precise. What I had learned after decades of surveying. Every strike needs a solid fulcrum. I rose and went to the kitchen. On the table, 3 glasses had been set out. One of them reflected the lamp and the oven's flame, casting a red streak like blood. I stared at it for a long time, eyes tracing that clear glass, then nodded quietly. Tomorrow, I told myself, each of them will drink exactly what they prepared for the other. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Early flakes quietly coated the roof, whiteness that made the heart ache. The wind whistled through the cracks, but the kitchen remained warm, warmed by the heat of a plan now complete. I looked at the glass again. The reflection in it cast a faint image of me against the pane, the father they were about to send away. I smiled softly, my voice hoarse but steady. They don't know. This reflection is the true farewell. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky over Orofino turned amber. The last rays of sunlight slipped through the pines by the porch, touching the white tablecloth where I had already placed 3 sets of silverware, a golden roast turkey, and 3 glasses of red wine gleaming like liquid amber. The house was filled with the scent of butter, nutmeg, and pumpkin pie. In that moment, if someone didn't know what was coming, they would have thought it was just another peaceful Thanksgiving dinner. Thomas and Grace arrived right on time. She wore a pale red dress, a pearl necklace, and lipstick that matched the wine. Thomas wore a suit, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. They greeted me with sweetness so artificial it almost shimmered. "You look well, Father. I'm glad you're not overworking," Thomas said, a hint of pride in his tone. Grace smiled softly. "Let me pour the wine. It's your favorite, isn't it?" I nodded calmly. Inside, I already knew every move they would make, not by guessing, but because I had seen the proof. 3 days earlier, when I checked the mini camera in the kitchen, I caught Grace opening her purse, taking out a small amber vial, labeled Temazepam 15 milligrams, RX, Grace Avery, lot 3217-H. Later, while cleaning the guest bathroom, I found an empty blister pack with the same lot number in the trash. I photographed it, archived it, and sent it to Sheriff Miles Harlan. He cross-checked with Orofino Pharmacy's records and confirmed it was a legitimate prescription filled just 4 days earlier. The police logged the details, adding the lot number to the Elder Abuse Prevention Case File 12-117C. So when I sat there watching them pour the wine, I didn't have to wonder anymore. The evidence was already sealed. Now it was time to let them perform their plan. Grace poured the wine into 3 glasses. When she turned to fetch another bottle, I caught her hand slipping a small packet from her dress pocket, tearing it open and stirring it into one of the glasses. The motion was precise, fast, something only a man trained to observe nature for decades would notice. The powder dissolved, leaving no trace but a faint ring of bubbles that disappeared a moment later. I smiled and said nothing. In fieldwork, sometimes you have to pretend not to see more. Tonight was no different. Grace turned back, eyes gleaming, to Thanksgiving and to family. Thomas raised his glass, his voice clear but cold. To Father, who's lived long enough? I looked at the glass before me, the candlelight dancing across the surface like small flames. I feigned a sneeze, clumsily dropping my napkin. Good heavens, I'm getting clumsy in my old age. As Grace turned to fetch a tissue, I stood, grabbed the serving tray from the counter, pretending to adjust the cranberry sauce. In that instant, my hand smoothly switched the glasses, the drugged one onto the tray, mine back in its place. When I sat down again, Thomas was distracted by his phone, and Grace was still bent over the cabinet. No one noticed. Grace smiled, thinking I was oblivious. She lifted her glass. Thomas clinked it, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. I raised mine slowly, looked straight into my son's eyes, and said quietly, To you, for your final lesson. The 3 glasses touched with a crisp, delicate ring. The wine slid warm and heavy down my throat, oak-scented, and in that flavor I could almost hear the silence of justice stepping out of the forest. 5 minutes later, Thomas began to gasp. He clutched his chest, trying to speak, but couldn't. The glass slipped from his hand, rolled onto the floor, spilling wine that looked like streaks of blood across the wood. Grace screamed, jumping up. Thomas, what's wrong? I stayed seated, eyes fixed on him. His face twitched, then went still as he collapsed, his head striking the table's edge. The air thickened, filled only with the wind at the window and the ticking of the clock. I looked at Grace, my voice no louder than a breath. Don't worry, you'll have time to tell the police everything. They're on their way. Grace froze, lips trembling, eyes wide with terror. I stood, picked up my phone, and pressed send on the pre-written message to Sheriff Harlan. Wineglass switched, substance confirmed. I set the phone down, glanced at Thomas's motionless body, then at Grace, a woman who now looked as if she'd seen a ghost. My son has paid the price for his greed. As for you, Grace, the rest belongs to the court. Outside, the snow was falling harder. The light from the forest reflected through the glass, casting a cold silver over the room. In that house once filled with memories, the clock kept ticking, the heartbeat of justice, neither fast nor slow, only exact. 30 seconds after the fall, the sound of the shattering glass still lingered somewhere in the wooden kitchen. I stood, picked up the phone from the table, and dialed 911, my voice so calm it surprised even me. Orofino Emergency Dispatch. What's your situation? I think my son's been poisoned, I said. He drank wine and suddenly collapsed at the table. The address is Hollow Pines Lodge, Highway 11 north of town. It may be a drug reaction. I ended the call and stood still. Outside, the forest began to howl in the wind, while inside, Grace stumbled toward Thomas, shaking him in panic. Thomas, wake up! Do you hear me? I watched, my hands steady. 10 minutes, I thought. Justice will arrive. From afar, sirens began to echo through the pines, low and mournful. Red and blue lights swept across the wooden walls, glinting on the family photographs and the table still shimmering with wine fumes. The door burst open as Sheriff Miles Harlan entered, followed by Officer Cole and 2 EMTs. They moved with practiced coordination, fast, precise, wordless. Mr. Leonard Pike? Harlan asked. I'm here. Please step back a few feet. I moved toward the bookcase. The EMTs knelt beside Thomas, checking his pulse and shining a light into his pupils. Still a faint reflex, but heart rate is slow, one said. They placed an oxygen mask and prepared the stretcher. Meanwhile, Officer Cole activated his body camera and began his field report. Time of record, 1739 hours. Location, Hollow Pines Lodge. Suspected poisoning via alcohol or sedative. 2 individuals present, Mr. Leonard Pike and Ms. Grace Avery. Cole panned the camera. Grace trembled, face pale, clutching her purse. When Officer Harlan asked to inspect it, she stammered, I don't know what happened. He just drank wine and... Do you have any medication with you, ma'am? Harlan asked evenly. Grace hesitated, then nodded. Sleeping pills. Mine. Temazepam. Please hand them over for inspection. She opened her purse, pulled out the amber bottle, her hand shaking. Harlan carefully sealed it in an evidence bag labeled Evidence 1A, signed it, and tagged it as part of the scene. Thank you, ma'am, he said politely but coldly. You're surrendering this voluntarily, correct? Grace nodded, as if realizing she had already stepped into the abyss. Then the door opened again. 2 women entered. Julia Thompson, legal representative of Portland Education Foundation, accompanied by Mara. Both wore dark coats, their expressions firm. Mara held a red notary folder stamped with a seal. Julia carried a stack of documents and a certified copy of the deed transfer. Sheriff, Mara said, I'm authorized to submit the notarized deed transfer, filed at the recorder's office. Reference number 45-728-C, confirming transfer of ownership of Hollow Pines Lodge from Mr. Leonard Pike to the Portland Education Foundation. Harlan nodded, accepting the file. Julia continued, her voice clear and deliberate. This property is now legally under public trust. Mr. Pike retains only a life estate, the lifetime right of residence. All property on site, including material evidence, is therefore public property. We are in full cooperation with law enforcement. Grace jumped to her feet, screaming, That's impossible! This is our house. We've lived here all year. He's old. He has no right. Mara turned to her, eyes sharp as steel. No, Miss Avery. This isn't your house. It's public property. And your crime is now public, too. In that instant, the patrol lights reflected through the window, washing Grace's face in alternating red and blue. Pale, twisted between terror and rage. The EMTs lifted Thomas onto the stretcher, while Officer Cole photographed the scene. The dinner table, the 3 glasses of wine, the pill bottle, and the unfinished POA document. Harlan signed his notes aloud. Field Report 22-11-24. Suspicious poisoning. Confirmed presence of sedative substance. Evidence collected. Wine glass, prescription bottle, video device. When he turned to me, I gave a small nod. I warned you earlier, Miles, I said quietly. I just didn't expect they'd pick a holiday. Harlan exhaled heavily. I've seen greed before, Leonard, but never one so methodically staged. Good thing you were ahead of them. I didn't reply. My eyes drifted to the kitchen. The tiny red light of the mini-camera still blinked, reflecting off the wooden cabinet. It had captured everything, from the moment Grace tore open the packet to Thomas's collapse and the officer's arrival. Grace followed my gaze, realized what it meant, and sank into a chair, her eyes hollow. Outside, the red and blue lights of the patrol cars flashed against the falling snow, merging with the pale glow of the ambulance. The snow grew thicker, blanketing the road down to town. Inside, within the house that now belonged to Justice, there remained only the wind and the faint hum of the camera. Still recording. The red light blinked once more, then went out. The scene froze in silence, the final image of a plan that had collapsed on itself. 2 weeks later, snow covered all of Orofino. The road leading down to town still bore the tire marks from that night. Only now the flashing red and blue lights were gone, replaced by the faint yellow glow of street lamps shining through the cold mist. I sat on the porch, a wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, a steaming cup of coffee beside me. In my hands was a small black notebook, labeled Evidence Log, its pages filled with dates, evidence codes, and blue ink notes. Every line was a step taken by justice. The local newspaper, the Orofino Chronicle, lay neatly on the wooden table. The front page headline read in bold letters, "Couple arrested for plotting to poison father. Property transferred to Community Education Fund." Beneath it were two small photographs, Thomas Pike and Grace Avery, heads bowed, eyes empty as they were led out of the county courthouse. The caption was clear. Federal grand jury indicts on charges of attempted assault and document forgery. No bail granted as related assets have been seized. The article described the lab results. Wine sample recovered from the scene confirmed the presence of temazepam at levels more than 10 times the standard sedative dose. Below that was a quote from Sheriff Harlan. The suspects had planned to transfer property ownership through forged documents, but were thwarted by the prior notarized record filed by the Portland Education Foundation. I folded the paper and set it aside, my eyes resting on the uneven handwriting inside the notebook. November 24th. Begin observation. Grace purchases medication. November 27th. Verify lot number sent to Harlan. November 28th. Dinner. Plan concluded. The ink had smudged in places where snow had melted on my gloves that night. The wind swept across the porch, carrying the damp scent of pine resin. I looked at the trees in front of the house, each branch heavy with white frost. In that stillness I thought of Margaret, my late wife, and the words she once said. Justice never arrives in a hurry, but when it does, it forgets no one. Perhaps she was right. That Thanksgiving night, the wind carried away the last traces of deceit, leaving behind a new kind of quiet, the quiet that exists only when the truth has been fully written. The phone suddenly buzzed on the table. The screen showed Mara Kincaid's name. I picked up. "Leonard, news from the court." Her voice came through, clear and formal. "You've been called as the primary witness for the upcoming trial. The jury wants to hear your direct testimony." I stayed silent for a few seconds, watching a snowflake land on the railing and slowly melt into a drop of water under the dim light. "Are you ready?" Mara asked softly. I smiled faintly, my voice low and steady, like an oath to the world around me. "I've been ready since the night they said, 'You won't live through Thanksgiving.'" On the other end, Mara paused, then replied quietly, "Then justice will be in session on Monday." I set the phone down. In the distance, church bells tolled through the fog, their echoes stretching like the rhythm of time itself. I took a deep breath, closed the evidence log, and placed it beside the now cold cup of coffee. The wind swept through the porch, flipping the pages of the newspaper until it stopped on the last line of the article. Justice may sleep through storms, but it never dies with them. I looked out at the last light of the day filtering through the snow-laden pines, and knew the storm had passed, but the echo of justice was only beginning. That winter morning, the Clearwater County Courthouse was packed. From the outer hall, the pale sunlight reflected off the old stone walls and glimmered through frosted glass bearing the state seal. Footsteps, rustling papers, murmurs, all blended into the thick, anxious hum of waiting. I sat in the front row, my gray suit worn but pressed, the evidence log before me, and beside it, Mara Kincaid, her eyes steady but carrying a quiet warmth. The side door opened. 2 officers led Thomas and Grace inside. Thomas wore a white shirt, wrists cuffed, face hard as granite. Grace kept her head bowed, hair falling across her face, shoulders trembling. Gone was the arrogance of Thanksgiving night. Only emptiness and shame remained. I didn't look at them. My hand rested on the black notebook, fingers tracing the line that read, Case 22-1124. Judge Eleanor Whitby entered, striking her gavel. The court convenes for the trial of the state of Idaho versus Thomas Pike and Grace Avery on charges of attempted assault and document forgery. Prosecutor Mark Llewellyn rose. His voice carried effortlessly, calm but resolute, because the evidence spoke for itself. Your Honor, this is not merely an attempted poisoning. It is a betrayal of the deepest kind. Betrayal of family, of trust, and of human decency. He laid out each piece of evidence: the video footage from the kitchen mini camera, the signed crime scene report from Sheriff Harlan, the toxicology results confirming temazepam, and finally the notarized deed transfer showing Leonard's lawful donation of Hollow Pines Lodge to the public foundation. When the video played, the lights dimmed. The screen showed Grace pouring wine, discreetly opening a packet of white powder, stirring it, then smiling as she turned back to the table. The air in the courtroom froze. Someone gasped softly. Grace broke down, sobbing, her shoulders shaking. Thomas stared blankly at the screen, lips pressed tight, unable to speak. Judge Whitby looked directly at them. Miss Avery, Mr. Pike, do either of you wish to address the court? Thomas said nothing. Grace cried out between tears, We just wanted him to sell the house. I never meant to kill anyone. The prosecutor replied evenly, And your method of persuasion was a high-dose sedative, in wine, on Thanksgiving? Grace choked, no words left. I sat still, not turning. There was nothing I needed to say. Everything had already spoken for me. The light from the window cast a glow across the judge's bench and onto my hair, as if the entire room had been washed in truth. When the video ended, the prosecutor closed his folder. Your Honor, we do not seek harsh punishment. Only that justice be remembered. Judge Whitby wrote a few notes, then struck her gavel softly. The court hereby sentences Defendant Thomas Pike, 4 years probation with 400 hours of community service at a local charity. Defendant Grace Avery, 2 years imprisonment for active participation in the poisoning attempt and document forgery. Both are prohibited from contacting Mr. Leonard Pike for a period of 5 years under protective order. She paused, then looked toward me, her expression gentle yet firm. Mr. Pike, your justice was silent, but it will echo. The room went utterly still. I nodded without speaking. Sometimes silence is the only answer a conscience needs. As the crowd began to disperse, Mara stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on my shoulder. Hollow Pines is still standing, Leonard, she whispered, and it will keep shining. I smiled faintly, glancing through the courthouse window. Outside, snow drifted softly, catching the gold of the streetlights. In that quiet glow, I felt what remains after justice. Not triumph, but the calm of a man who has walked the path he believed in. The final strike of the gavel echoed through the chamber like a bell. Leonard closed the notebook. 1 year later, spring returned to the Hollow Pines forest, bringing the first warmth after long months of snow. Sunlight streamed through tall pines, filtering through the thin mist, and fell across the wooden porch where I stood. The dirt road leading to the house now bore a new sign, painted pale green. Avery Learning Lodge, outdoor education for rural kids. The house that had once witnessed a family tragedy now carried a different soul, peaceful, bright, and filled with laughter. In the yard, a dozen children ran across the grass, holding magnifying glasses, sketchbooks, and paint sets. Their laughter mixed with the scent of pine resin and the faint smoke from the volunteers' outdoor kitchen. On the wide porch, Mara Kincaid was helping a group of parents fill out enrollment forms. She turned to me with a soft smile. Leonard, Margaret would be proud to see this. I nodded gently. She always believed these woods could teach more than books ever could. In the center of the yard, a new bronze plaque was mounted on the cedar wall. Its engraving gleamed in the sunlight. Built with truth, given with grace. I looked at those words for a long time. They seemed to contain everything that had come before: pain, betrayal, and the quiet miracle of forgiveness. Mara walked over and handed me the old evidence log. "You should keep this," she said. "Someday these kids will understand why this place bears that name." I turned the yellowed pages and stopped at the last line from the previous year's trial. Beneath it I took a pen and wrote another line, my hand trembling slightly but steady enough to be clear. "Justice doesn't need a spotlight, only light filtering through the trees at the right moment." I closed the notebook and listened to the children's laughter outside. A blond boy held up an old soil depth gauge I once used and asked, "Mr. Leonard, is this for measuring how deep the ground goes?" I smiled warmly. "That's right, son. But remember, what matters more is how deep a person's heart can go." The children laughed and ran off again. The sun began to sink, casting long rays across the forest. I stepped onto the porch, resting my hand on the wooden door frame, the same one I had built with my own hands nearly 30 years ago. The air was filled with the scent of pine and fresh paint, familiar yet new, like a life rebuilt. I opened the door, stepped inside, and quietly closed it behind me. The wind swept through the forest, carrying the scent of warm pine wood and the distant sound of children's laughter. In that moment, I understood that true justice is not punishment. It is the ability of the human spirit to heal after the storm. The house stood still among the trees, sunlight piercing through the branches to strike the bronze plaque. The engraved words shimmered like a quiet prayer for my entire life, built with truth, given with grace. And somewhere in the whisper of the wind, I could almost hear Margaret's voice. "The forest still shines, Leonard." I smiled and closed my eyes, leaving behind the light, the laughter, and the scent of pine, symbols of forgiveness and peace. So we've reached the end of the light in the hollow pines, a story of a father who chose silence over revenge, truth over violence, and forgiveness as his rebirth. The justice in this story isn't loud or dazzling like a courtroom spotlight. It's the beam of light slipping through leaves, the warmth that lingers after a storm, the laughter of children in a forest that once held betrayal and tears. If you followed me to this final chapter, thank you for your patience and for believing that stories like this, though small, can still rekindle faith in justice, honesty, and compassion. Every view, every comment, every small you leave below this video is a candle that keeps stories like hollow pines alive. Not to reopen wounds, but to remind us that truth, when guarded with silence and kindness, will always find its way home. If you believe that justice doesn't shout, it glows, please subscribe, share this story, and comment the name of your city so I know how far the light of Hollow Pines has reached. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next story where justice remains silent but never fades.